On a cold November morning in 1944, Allied soldiers stationed in Belgium watched something strange unfold in the sky above them. A large American bomber, a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, was approaching from the east at low altitude. Its landing gear was already down. The engines were still running. From a distance, it appeared to be a damaged aircraft trying to make it back to friendly territory after a brutal mission over Germany. That alone was not unusual. By late 1944, Allied ground units had grown accustomed to seeing battered bombers limp home from combat. What made this aircraft different was the way it moved. It was steady, controlled, yet strangely quiet in another sense. There were no frantic corrections, no visible struggle to keep the machine airborne. It drifted across the sky as though following instructions that had already been given. The bomber descended toward an open field east of Brussels. Soldiers watched as the aircraft approached the ground, unsure whether it would crash violently or somehow survive the landing. The B-17 touched down hard in the muddy field. The wheels struck the ground, bounced once, and the aircraft slid across the earth before coming to a stop. For a few seconds there was silence. Then the soldiers began running toward the plane, expecting to find wounded crew members inside the fuselage. Instead, they found something far stranger. The cockpit was empty. The navigator's station was empty. The gun positions were empty. The massive bomber that had just landed behind Allied lines contained no crew at all. This moment is why the story survived long after the war ended. It looked impossible. A bomber that had crossed enemy territory descended and landed, yet somehow no one had been flying it. Over the years, rumors began to spread. Some said the pilot had died at the controls. Others claimed the aircraft had flown for hundreds of miles without a living crew. The truth was less supernatural, but no less remarkable. The empty airplane in that Belgian field was the result of a chain of decisions made hours earlier, decisions that began deep inside Germany during one of the most dangerous phases of the Allied strategic bombing campaign. The aircraft belonged to the United States Army Air Force's 8th Air Force, part of the massive daylight bombing effort that had been hammering German industry since 1942. By late 1944, the air war over Europe had reached an intense and brutal stage. Hundreds of heavy bombers crossed the continent almost daily. Some returned safely. Many came back damaged. Others never returned at all. The Flying Fortress that landed empty in Belgium had taken part in that struggle only hours earlier. To understand how a bomber could land itself behind Allied lines, the story must return to the moment when the mission began and to the dangerous skies over Merseburg, Germany. The aircraft that eventually landed empty in Belgium was a B-17G Flying Fortress, serial number 43-345-45, assigned to the 91st Bomb Group of the United States 8th Air Force. The 91st was one of the most experienced bomber units, operating from England. Since 1942, its crews had flown hundreds of missions over occupied Europe and Germany, attacking factories, rail networks, and oil refineries that supported the German war machine. By 1944, the group had already suffered heavy losses, but the campaign continued with relentless pressure. Strategic bombing had become a central pillar of Allied strategy. On 20th November 1944, the target was Merseburg. The city was a critical location in Germany's synthetic fuel industry. Nearby facilities produce aviation fuel and other petroleum products essential for the Luftwaffe and the German army. Destroying those plants meant grounding aircraft, slowing armored units, and weakening the entire German war effort. Because of that importance, Merseburg was heavily defended. Layers of anti-aircraft artillery surrounded the industrial complex. German flak batteries waited for the bombers long before they reached the target. When the formation of B-17 bombers approached the area that morning, the sky filled with bursts of black smoke from exploding flak shells. Anti-aircraft guns fired timed shells designed to detonate near incoming aircraft. Each explosion hurled fragments of steel through the air at high speed. Even a single fragment could tear through wings, fuel tanks, or engines. For bomber crews, flying through such defenses was one of the most dangerous experiences of the war. First Lieutenant Harold R. Goll, DeBolt, was flying B-17 number 43-30545 that day. Like most bomber pilots, he commanded a crew of 10 men. Each had a specialized role: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, and gunners positioned throughout the aircraft. Together they formed a small team responsible for guiding the bomber through enemy airspace and back again. During the attack on Merseburg, flak found the aircraft. Fragments tore through the bomber's structure, 2 engines were damaged severely enough to stop working. A third engine began losing power soon afterward. In a 4-engine bomber like the B-17, losing even one engine created serious problems. Losing 2 or 3 placed the aircraft in immediate danger. Speed dropped. Altitude became difficult to maintain. Control became harder with every passing minute. Despite the damage, DeBolt managed to keep the bomber flying. The crew turned west toward Allied territory, hoping to reach safety across the front lines. But the crippled aircraft was now fighting gravity as much as it was fighting the enemy. Every mile toward Belgium was another mile borrowed against the limits of the aircraft. By the time the bomber approached Belgium, the situation had changed again. The aircraft was no longer simply damaged. It was reaching the point where staying aboard could become fatal. That realization forced DeBolt to consider a decision that many bomber pilots eventually faced: whether the crew could safely remain inside the aircraft at all. The moment for that decision was approaching quickly. The most unusual part of the story began with a decision that, at the time, seemed completely logical. By the time Harold R. Anach, DeBolt's B-17, crossed into Belgian airspace, the bomber was no longer operating under normal conditions. 2 engines had already failed after the flak damage over Merseburg. A third engine was losing power. The aircraft had also taken structural hits. Altitude had dropped significantly, and maintaining stable flight required constant attention. The bomber was still moving west toward Allied territory, but it was doing so with very little margin left. For a heavy bomber crew, this moment represented one of the hardest judgments in combat aviation. A B-17 could sometimes survive extreme damage, but it could also fail suddenly if one more system collapsed. Pilots had to evaluate speed, altitude, engine performance, and structural damage all at once. The decision could not wait long. Staying aboard too long could trap the crew inside a crashing aircraft. Leaving too early could abandon a machine that might still reach safety. By the time the bomber approached lower altitude over Belgium, DeBolt had reached his conclusion. The aircraft could not safely carry 10 men any farther, but it might still be able to stay airborne long enough for them to escape. The B-17 had been designed with emergency procedures for exactly this kind of situation. Crews practiced bailout drills repeatedly during training in the United States and England. Each man knew where to go and how to leave the aircraft quickly. Under ideal circumstances, the pilot stabilized the bomber while the crew exited one by one through designated escape hatches. DeBolt began preparing the aircraft for that moment. He lowered the landing gear. This might seem unusual for a bailout, but the reasoning was simple. If the bomber eventually struck the ground, extended landing gear could help absorb some of the impact and reduce the chance of a violent crash. Then he adjusted the aircraft's trim and engaged the autopilot system. The autopilot on the B-17 was not capable of landing the aircraft by itself, but it could hold a heading and maintain relatively stable flight. If the bomber was already descending slowly, the system could keep it steady long enough for the crew to escape. One by one, the crew began to bail out. Each man clicked on his parachute and left the aircraft at low altitude over Belgian territory. The procedure was carried out quickly but carefully. Within minutes, the bomber that had crossed Germany with 10 men aboard was almost empty. DeBolt remained in the cockpit until the end. Pilots traditionally left last, ensuring that every other crew member had successfully exited the aircraft. Once the bomber was trimmed and stable, he finally jumped as well at roughly 800 feet above the ground. At that moment, the Flying Fortress continued west alone. No pilot, no crew, just momentum, gravity, and the last control settings that had been placed inside the cockpit. And for several minutes after the final man left the aircraft, the bomber kept flying. What happened next unfolded slowly enough that witnesses on the ground could watch the entire sequence develop. Allied soldiers stationed in Belgium saw the damaged bomber approaching from the east. The aircraft was descending gradually, but did not appear to be spiraling out of control. From a distance, it looked like a wounded bomber attempting a forced landing. That kind of sight was not unusual in late 1944. Allied forces had advanced deep into Western Europe following the Normandy invasion earlier that summer. Frontline soldiers and mechanics had already seen dozens of aircraft limp back from combat with shredded wings, damaged engines, or wounded crew members. The B-17 Flying Fortress had developed a reputation for surviving punishment that would destroy many other aircraft. But as the bomber drew closer, something about the approach looked different. There were no visible corrections in the flight path. Normally, a pilot making a forced landing would make small adjustments to keep the aircraft aligned with the terrain. The bomber approaching the Belgian field moved more steadily than that. Its descent remained stable and predictable. The landing gear was already extended. The nose remained level. The aircraft appeared to be following a simple glide path toward the ground. Then the B-17 touched down. The landing was rough, but survivable. One wheel dug into the muddy field, causing the aircraft to swing slightly to the side. The wing tip struck the ground, and part of the propeller assembly was damaged, but the massive bomber did not break apart. It slid across the field and came to rest with its fuselage still intact. For several seconds the aircraft sat motionless. Allied soldiers immediately ran toward the bomber. Their first expectation was obvious. A landing like that would almost certainly leave injured crew members inside the aircraft. Men might be trapped in the cockpit or in the rear sections of the fuselage. Fire could start at any moment. But when the soldiers climbed aboard, they discovered something no one expected. The cockpit was empty. The pilot's seat was empty. The co-pilot's position was empty. No navigator stood behind the instrument panel. No gunners were at their stations. The entire bomber was abandoned. The engines were silent. The aircraft was scarred and damaged from flak. But the crew had already left it far earlier in the sky. The soldiers standing in their Belgian field were staring at a combat aircraft that had completed its final approach alone. At that moment, the incident moved beyond ordinary wartime experience and into something far stranger. The immediate question spread quickly among the men who witnessed it. How could a heavy bomber cross enemy territory, descend toward the ground, and land without a single person inside the aircraft? The answer required looking not at the moment of landing, but at the design of the aircraft itself, and at the remarkable durability of the flying fortress. Stories like this often invite dramatic explanations. When people first hear about a bomber landing without a crew, the natural instinct is to imagine something extraordinary guiding the aircraft. But the real explanation lies in engineering, procedure, and a series of decisions made minutes before the crew abandoned the airplane. The B-17 Flying Fortress was never designed to land itself in the way modern aircraft sometimes can. There was no automated landing system. There was no computer guiding the plane to the ground. What it did have, however, was stability, and stability in aviation can carry an aircraft much farther than most people expect. The B-17 was built with wide wings, a large fuselage, and 4 powerful engines that gave the aircraft both lift and resilience. Even after heavy damage, a flying fortress could sometimes remain controllable for a surprising length of time. Pilots throughout the war reported aircraft returning to base with engines destroyed, control surfaces damaged, and entire sections of fuselage torn away. The design philosophy behind the bomber emphasized durability. If a crew could keep the aircraft stable long enough to reach friendly territory, survival was possible. In the case of serial number 43-38545, several factors worked together. First, DeBolt had already stabilized the aircraft before the crew bailed out. He trimmed the controls so the bomber maintained a steady descent rather than a sudden dive. Second, he engaged the autopilot system. The B-17 autopilot was not sophisticated by modern standards, but it could hold a heading and maintain basic flight stability. With the aircraft already descending slowly toward Belgium, that stability allowed the bomber to continue along the path it had been flying. The landing gear also played a critical role. Lowering the gear changed the aircraft's aerodynamics, increasing drag and helping the bomber slow down naturally. Instead of continuing to glide long distances, the aircraft began losing altitude more gradually and predictably. Gravity took over. Airspeed decreased. The aircraft continued drifting west toward open terrain. Meanwhile, the damage that had nearly destroyed the bomber also worked in its favor. With 2 engines already dead and another failing, the aircraft simply did not have the power to climb again. That meant it would continue descending until it eventually met the ground. But because it had been trimmed correctly, the descent remained relatively stable. All of these factors combined into something unusual but not impossible. A massive bomber, following the last instructions placed into its controls. Physics replaced the pilot. Momentum replaced decision-making. And because the bomber happened to be above Allied territory with relatively open ground beneath it, the aircraft eventually reached the Earth without exploding. The result looked miraculous to those who saw it. But in reality, it was the final echo of the pilot's decisions still guiding the machine minutes after he had left the cockpit. Understanding that explanation helps clarify the event. Yet it also raises another question. If the mechanics of the landing can be explained, Why did the story grow into something far larger than the facts themselves? That answer lies in the strange way wartime memory works, and in how extraordinary moments slowly transform into legend. The incident in Belgium did not become famous immediately. In the closing months of World War II, thousands of aircraft were flying across Europe every week. Bombing missions continued daily. Aircraft were damaged, lost, or forced to land in unexpected places. For the soldiers who witnessed the empty B-17 in that muddy Belgian field, the moment was unforgettable, but the war itself was moving too quickly for every unusual event to become widely known. Yet certain stories have a way of spreading quietly through military units. Pilots heard about it first. Mechanics heard about it later. Eventually, the story reached historians studying the strategic bombing campaign. The basic facts were clear and well documented. A B-17 from the 91st Bomb Group had been damaged over Merseburg on 21 November 1944. Its pilot had ordered the crew to bail out over Belgium, and the aircraft had continued flying long enough to land behind Allied lines without anyone aboard. That sequence alone was remarkable. But human memory rarely leaves remarkable stories unchanged. Over time, the story began to grow. Distances became longer. Details became sharper. Some accounts moved the date slightly. Others described the landing as nearly perfect rather than rough. The most dramatic versions introduced a phrase that captured the imagination of later audiences, the idea that a dead pilot's plane had flown hundreds of miles alone. The phrase was powerful, but it simplified the real chain of events. The pilot had not died at the controls. The crew had not vanished mysteriously. They had bailed out safely over Belgium after stabilizing the aircraft. What remained in the sky was not a ghostly airplane guided by supernatural forces, but a damaged bomber obeying aerodynamic laws. Still, the legend continued to spread. Part of the reason lies in how war stories are remembered. The air war over Europe produced countless dramatic moments: dogfights, emergency landings, heroic rescues. But few scenes were as visually striking as the one witnessed in that Belgian field. A four-engine bomber sitting silently on the ground with no crew inside is the kind of image that stays in the mind. Another reason lies in the reputation of the B-17 itself. Throughout the war, the Flying Fortress became a symbol of resilience. Photographs circulated of bombers returning to England with missing tail sections, shredded wings, or engines destroyed. Crews trusted the aircraft because it often brought them home despite incredible damage. The empty B-17 in Belgium became another example of that reputation. Even without a crew, the machine had carried forward the final instructions of its pilot and reached Allied territory intact. In that sense, the legend contains a kind of truth, not the supernatural version that appeared in later retellings, but the quieter reality that made the story worth remembering. A bomber had crossed the battlefield, lost its crew, and still completed its final flight. And the war that created such moments was far from over. Behind the strange story of an empty bomber landing in Belgium lies a much larger reality about the air war over Europe. By late 1944, the strategic bombing campaign had become one of the largest and most demanding operations of the Second World War. The United States 8th Air Force alone was flying thousands of heavy bomber sorties every month from bases in England. Their targets were factories, rail networks, oil refineries, and transportation centers deep inside Germany. The objective was simple in theory: destroy the industrial system that allowed Nazi Germany to continue fighting. In practice, the cost was enormous. Bomber crews operated in one of the most dangerous environments of the war. Aircraft like the B-17 Flying Fortress flew long daylight missions directly over heavily defended German territory. Enemy fighters could attack the formations, and anti-aircraft artillery protected nearly every major target. German flak batteries fired shells designed to explode near incoming bombers, scattering fragments capable of tearing through aluminum skin, engines, fuel tanks, or crew compartments. The statistics revealed just how dangerous those missions were. Early in the bombing campaign, losses could reach 5% or more for a single mission. That might sound small, but over the course of many missions it meant survival odds dropped sharply. A crew completing 25 missions, the standard combat tour early in the war, faced a real chance of not returning. Units like the 91st Bomb Group experienced that danger repeatedly. Operating from bases in England since 1942, the group flew hundreds of missions across occupied Europe and Germany. Aircraft were damaged frequently. Some crews made emergency landings. Others parachuted out over friendly territory. Many were lost entirely. Against that backdrop, the event involving B-17 serial 438555 represents a small but revealing moment in the wider campaign. The crew survived because they recognized when the aircraft could no longer carry them safely. The pilot stabilized the bomber and ordered a bailout at the right moment. That decision allowed 10 men to live. The empty airplane that landed behind Allied lines became a symbol not of supernatural mystery, but of how the air war actually worked. Machines absorbed punishment. Crews made rapid decisions under pressure. Survival often depended on seconds. Normally, the story would end differently. A bomber that damaged would crash somewhere over Europe, and the official record would note another lost aircraft. Instead, the Flying Fortress touched down in a Belgian field, leaving behind an image that seemed almost impossible. A massive combat aircraft resting quietly on the ground. Its crew already gone, and that image would remain long after the war itself came to an end. In the broader history of World War II, the B-17 that landed in Belgium did not change the outcome of the conflict. It did not destroy an enemy factory or alter the course of a battle. Yet the incident endured in memory for a different reason. It captured something essential about the relationship between the machines of war and the people who flew them. The B-17 Flying Fortress had been designed as a weapon, a four-engine bomber built to carry thousands of pounds of bombs across enemy territory. But it was also designed with a different purpose in mind, to keep its crew alive long enough to return home. Engineers reinforced the structure, separated fuel tanks, and created redundant systems so the aircraft could survive damage that would destroy many other planes. Throughout the war, that design proved itself again and again. Photographs from the European theatre show bombers returning to base with engines missing, tails shattered, and wings riddled with holes. Crews often described the aircraft as stubborn, a machine that seemed determined to remain airborne even when logic suggested it should fall. The landing in Belgium was one of the most unusual examples of that reputation. After the crew bailed out, the bomber continued to follow the final conditions set by its pilot: landing gear lowered, controls trimmed, autopilot engaged. Those settings allowed the aircraft to descend gradually until it reached the ground. It was not a perfect landing. The aircraft was damaged in the process, but it survived long enough to create a scene that soldiers would remember for years afterward. An empty bomber resting quietly in a field. A cockpit with no pilot. A war machine that had completed its last flight alone. Stories like this persist because they reveal the human decisions hidden inside mechanical events. The bomber did not act on its own. Its path had been shaped minutes earlier by a pilot who understood both the limits of his aircraft and the responsibility he carried for the men aboard it. Once those men parachuted safely into Belgium, the machine continued forward on its own momentum. For a brief moment, the final act of the flight belonged entirely to physics and engineering. Eventually, the engines stopped. The war moved on. New missions were planned, new aircraft launched, and the bombing campaign continued until Germany's surrender in May 1945. But the sight of that silent flying fortress in a Belgian field remained a reminder of how thin the line between survival and disaster could be. Sometimes the difference was a single decision made at the right moment, and sometimes, even after the crew had gone, the aircraft carried that decision all the way to the ground.